Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you're tuning in from, and welcome to Eval Cafe. My name is John Akwete. I'm the coordinator for Eval Cafe here at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University, and I'll be your host for today. Though we are all tuning in virtually, we would like to recognize that Western Michigan University is located on land historically occupied by Ijawa, Odawa, and Boduwami nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral land of the Three Fire Confederacy and consider the sacred land of all indigenous peoples and their continuous presence, especially wherever you may be tuning in from. The Evaluation Cafe is a weekly series presented throughout the academic year that features guest speakers on a wide range of evaluation topics, as evident in all our presentations last semester, and has been taking place at the Evaluation Center since the early 1980s. Though this has traditionally been a small in-person gathering that has been recorded and shared online, continuously from last semester, this spring 2022 speaker series, while some may be hybrid, all events will be open to the public to join online, regardless of location. For our 7th event this semester, we are delighted to be joined by our distinguished guest, Dr. Laura Peck. Dr. Peck, she's a principal scientist, the Director of Research Monitoring and Evaluation Capacity Center at ABT Associates Social and Economic Policy Division. She's also the interim co-editor-in-chief, American Journal of Evaluation. Before we get started, for those new to Evaluation Cafe, we typically have 30 to 40-minute presentation or discussion followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A section. Like our previous event, our guests have requested that participants submit their questions in the chat box at any time, at any point, so she can pause every few minutes to respond to those questions. Before we get started, Dr. Peck, just take a few minutes, 30 seconds to talk a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up where you are today as the Director of Research Monitoring and Evaluation Capacity Center at ABT Associate. Then you can proceed with your presentation.
Great, well, thank you. So as John introduced me, my name is Laura Peck. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you today. My apartment is not this cool, but I'm coming to you from the 110 Wall Street WeWork, which is located on the Lenape ancestral grounds. And I actually am going to spend more than a minute talking about my background, because I think that when you had invited me to be part of this discussion, it was a little bit more in that area, and in addition to the paper that I was thinking that you would be interested to hear, at least the doctoral students. So I will share a little bit more of my own background and then kind of reflect on this paper that I had published a couple of years ago. So I'm going to share what is somewhat of a circuitous route and let you know that I came to evaluation research kind of circuitously. I was an undergraduate in humanities at Arizona State University, but I was also kind of a do-gooder. And so that's what took me to the Wagner School at NYU, where I earned my MPA, after which I got a job at this great company called Apt Associates. And I'll correct you, it's not an acronym. It's actually the last name of the company's founder, Clark Apt. So I worked for a while at Apt after earning my MPA, and that work actually convinced me that I needed to go back to graduate school, which I did. Went back to NYU and earned my Ph.D. in public administration with a focus in research methods, poverty studies, and public policy. And that year was fortunate enough to get the one position in either New York or Arizona that aligned with my interests, and I joined the faculty at Arizona State University. So you can see I kind of went this way and then I went back that way. And after being on the tenure track and earning tenure and serving as associate dean, I had postponed taking sabbatical but was sort of itchy to do a little something to reinvigorate my research agenda. And so I had the opportunity to, again, work at Apt Associates as kind of as a consultant, and I did so on leave from my university position. And at that point, after a year, when I was supposed to go back to the university, I was kind of having too much fun in my job. I didn't feel like I was quite done with that. And so I extended my leave for another year, after which point I had to decide, do I go back to my pretty awesome university gig, or do I stay in my pretty awesome research job? And as you can probably tell, I decided to leave the university and stay positioned at Apt doing research. And that's what I'm going to kind of tell you more about in terms of what I do in that capacity and what that's like. You'll also see here that I have this other title. In addition to being a principal scientist, I'm global director for Apt of our Research Monitoring and Evaluation Capability Center. So even though I'm positioned in one part of the company where I do US domestic kind of social policy evaluation, I get the opportunity to look across the company in cross-cutting ways at the kind of work that we do, thinking about how to bring the best of our methodologies to all of our portfolio. So I've dotted on the right side of the screen there some of the agencies that I have done project work for. Maybe the print is small, but they include the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Education, Labor, the USDA, and Social Security Administration. And those are ones where I've actually had a project role. There are handfuls of others, both in the US and abroad, where I've kind of in my role as global director served in an advisory capacity or as kind of a senior technical reviewer. So at some point, if there are people who are interested, I'm happy to talk more about the ins and outs between academia and industry. But really the main part of my presentation is about that industry, the big evaluation enterprises, as they're labeled in this paper that I did for New Directions for Evaluation. It was a few years ago. I'm sure all of you are familiar, since you're affiliated with the Evaluation Center, with NDE. It's an all special issue journal. And this particular special issue focused on kind of the industry itself and supply and demand within the evaluation industry. And the editors for this NDE number 160, they asked if I would write the contribution on the big evaluation enterprises. Who are they? How do they get their work? How do they execute that work? And how do they compare to the small evaluation enterprises? So actually, probably, well, no, it's, I was going to say that it's one of the more unique papers for me. I'm sort of a quantoid, and so I tend to think about methodology and quantitative analysis and impact analysis and how we more precisely estimate impacts overall and for subgroups. And so this is a really different paper for me to write, and it gave me an opportunity to kind of step back and reflect on what and how I do the work that I do. So I'll just walk you through some of the findings from the paper and then happy to take questions. Oh, but John, you also told me to breathe every once in a while to see if there are any questions along the way. All right, so the who are they question. This, of course, this is a few years old. This is the top 20, as I labeled them, by their 2016 federal prime contract dollars. So the way that I got this information was actually through a bit of a qualitative and snowball-y sample. I started by asking my colleagues, when you think of our industry, who do you think of as our competitors? And I sort of came up with a whole list of organizations that way, and then had a research assistant kind of dig into the data and help me identify which of the kind of whole list of kind of brain dump organizations, which ones of those really could be considered big. And so these are the 20 firms that kind of met the big criteria. And you'll see across them that 8 of them are nonprofit in their organizational status, making the other 12 for-profits, but 10 of those still have social missions. So it is an industry that is really about evidence generation for the social good. And when we look at kind of how those federal contract dollars are distributed, they are listed here in order of kind of their prime contract dollars size. And I've included kind of the share of their overall revenues that come from federal contract dollars. And the kind of the top 3 agencies that not by dollars, but by kind of frequency were the provided funding to these organizations are the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services, Education, and the Agency for International Development. And so I've indicated where the majority of funds come from for these organizations if it was one of those 3. And then you can see where they are blanks. It actually turns out that most of those are defense, or yeah, I think those are defense where they don't have a majority of funds that come from one of those 3 agencies. So the one thing that I think is pretty interesting in this industry is that there's a lot of, I mentioned federal prime contract dollars, and that's prime as opposed to subcontractor, right? So the prime agency is the one that's the lead company. And in the article, I think I did the math as of the point that I wrote that article to conclude that of the 14 projects that I had been involved in as of that point, 7 of them were ones that included some kind of subcontracting arrangement. So a full half of apt work that I have done involved a subcontractor, either that apt was the subcontractor to another organization, or vice versa, that one of those big 20, frankly, had been one of our subcontractors. And so you can see in this the red dot over there on the right, that's apt, and you can see that the density of the line refers to stronger subcontracting dollar relationships. And you can see that we have connections to MDRC or AIR or the Urban Institute that are companies that we do partner with in carrying out our work, as well as this whole like slew of little dots, individual consultants or mom and pop shops, or other smaller companies. So that's sort of an interesting, we are, I think, a unique industry in that way, in that a lot of the work that we conduct sort of demands that we do so in partnership.
So Laura, where did you find that data?
Yeah. So these data come from the records that, oh my gosh, it's been so long that I'm going to forget the gruesome details. But there are, apt has a kind of business development unit that collects data from, I know in the nonprofit side, it's those 990 forms. They are records of government contracts. And so I had one of our RAs sort of dig into them. And the reason that I included only 8 rather than all 20 firms here is that there was some data availability challenges. So it really just looks at the 8 for whom these data were available, and we didn't have missing data on subcontracts.
Okay.
So the how do we get our work? Usually it involves responding to requests for proposals, RFPs, or requests for quotation, funding opportunity announcements, or responding to kind of BPA opportunities, which I'll talk about in a second. And these are kind of situations where government will put out there that they have a call for proposals, they want some work done, and we pull it together to respond to those by writing a proposal about how we would go about doing the work. And one of the things that sort of that I kind of go through in the article is this concept of a blanket purchase agreement, because there's also another mechanism called an IDIQ, which I always forget what it stands for, but it's sort of like indefinite quantity. And anyway, probably among you, you probably know what those are. What it does is there's sort of this BPA and IDIQ, for example, create kind of a two-phase process where you apply to be on the short list of companies that then gets an opportunity within a smaller competitive set to respond to particular task orders or kind of, you know, RFPs under the umbrella of the BPA or the IDIQ. And so from one perspective, what that does is for companies like APT, we want to be on those BPAs and IDIQs that are aligned with the kind of work that we want to do, because it kind of it gives us one step in the door. It removes some of the competition associated with getting that work. But you know, the question that I explore in the paper too is, does that create some kind of entry barrier such that small firms might be precluded from participating in these kinds of government opportunities? And I would say maybe sometimes, but there are also BPAs where there's a requirement that there be a small business set aside, or that that a BPA can be designated exclusively for small businesses. And so those are situations too, where when we think about going after a particular piece of work, whether we will partner with a small business in order either to get us to an opportunity that we otherwise wouldn't have, or to be more competitive for a particular opportunity. And usually these are contracts, government contracts, as opposed to grants. That universities do tend to kind of go after grants more than contracts. And when I kind of set out initially in talking about this, I said we usually get our work through response to these kinds of opportunities, but not always, because there are some situations where we want to contribute to shaping funder demand, either in terms of what the research should be or for designing programs. Sometimes that involves more engagement with foundation funders rather than federal funders. But we do, through our current work and through the connections that we have to project officers in the federal agencies, have opportunities to kind of suggest what we think the next frontier should be. They listen, they hold conferences on those cutting edge topics, and then think about how they might be introducing those ideas into their request for proposals. Within the top 20, there are some firms that do a better job of shaping demand. I would say I would put MDRC and the Urban Institute, for example, on that list, and that's in part because they more so than places like APT or Mathematica, have greater foundation funding that creates a little bit more of the flexibility to shape that demand than responding more exclusively to opportunities that government puts out there. Okay, so the next topic that I wanted to talk about is how do we execute our work? And I describe this in the paper as sort of a team sport or art, as the case may be, because it really does involve a team effort. In my university life, I was sort of that one person that did that thing that I did. I tended to work, by myself with maybe one or two partners, maybe with a graduate student or two on a much smaller scale. But the work that we do in kind of the big enterprises, as this paper and this talk are about, really demands teams. Some of the projects that we're working on are, many multi-million-dollar, multi-year projects. It's just not even a thing that one person would do that, right? It's a team event. And so I've proposed one kind of org chart here to highlight to you the roles that people have on a kind of large scale evaluation project like those that I work on. And this is one picture, and I'll kind of discuss a little bit alternatives, but generally there can be principal investigator or co-principal investigators on the work that I do. There tend to be co-PIs where one person is sort of the methodological expert and the other person is a substantive expert. They come together to partner well to be the intellectual leads for the project. Then we have a project director, and if it's a large enough project, a deputy project director, and those comprise the project management, where they are the ones who are submitting invoices, tracking labor hours, ensuring that travel costs are paid and within budget, and undertaking all of the compliance work that is required of carrying out a government contract. We have over here the project quality advisors, where there are people who will kind of from both technical and methodological perspectives, review project documents and procedures to be sure that they're as good as possible. We often have management oversight, ensuring that we are, being compliant to the contract demands. And so that's kind of the leadership structure. And then within that, I've given an example here of 3 boxes. I'm right now on a project where I think we have 6 kind of main teams of people that are the worker bees, if you will, that are carrying out the work. Within each box, there's likely going to be a lead. And I've indicated here data collection, implementation analysis, and impact analysis, where there will be, for example, if our data collection includes a survey, a whole team of people in that box that are part of call center and data structure procedures to ensure data security and high response rates to surveys. Other kinds of data collection would involve administrative data involving partnering with agencies to extract those data, again, in a secure fashion, to be sure that we are honoring the data security requirements. And then implementation analysis teams will very often involve field work. The last 2 years have shown us that field work can actually be done virtually to a certain extent, though with the world opening back up, people I think are excited to be going on in-person site visits again to meet with people in housing authorities or schools or wherever the research is taking place to understand how in practice the program that we're evaluating is being implemented. And that's really important for descriptive purposes, and also just from the perspective of conducting a formative or implementation kind of evaluation. The main work that I do is really on the impact analysis side, where we'll have a lead for the impact analysis that is about partnering with the data collection people to be sure that we have the data in the right shape and form, and executing the analysis with a team of statisticians, sometimes sampling statisticians, and ultimately with an eye toward what do we need to produce to communicate about those results clearly in the end when we write up our reports. So this is one picture. You could also imagine that the PI and project management boxes are kind of side by side, or sometimes even reversed. Sort of depends on the project whether kind of the project management is kind of the lead or the intellectual leads are thought of as the leads. So this is just a suggestion of how it works, and in practice there are many variants on that. So one of the things that in writing this piece for the NDE, the editors asked me to think about and write about was how do the big enterprises compare to the small enterprises? And so there are a couple of ways in which I can reflect on that. I haven't worked in a small enterprise, so I don't know. So this is gleaned from having read, a draft of the companion piece in that NDE that discusses in more detail the small enterprises. But one of the things that, in producing the NDE issue became clear to me is that capacity is a really big difference between big and small companies in this evaluation space. And in big companies, it actually means that staff have the luxury, if you will, to be able to specialize. So we have sampling statisticians and survey data collection leads and qualitative data leads that are distinct people. Whereas if you work in a small company, it might be that you have to have that whole slew of skills at your disposal to be able to bring whatever is needed on a particular project to meet that project's demands. In the same way that, I feel like I get the luxury to be the technical intellectual lead for a project. I don't really have to deal with some of the invoicing and contracting stuff. So because we have an opportunity to divide and conquer in that way. That's similar also when it comes to writing proposals. Because I'm in a big firm, it means that I have, in some cases, it feels like quite a machinery behind me in executing proposal work, where there are staff that will fill out those compliance matrices and process all of the CVs and resumes that need to get put into the back end of proposals. And that gives me the opportunity to focus on the technical approach and be a creative thinker there and write that up to be convincing that we're the company that you ought to choose to carry out this work. So I think it's one of the things that when we interview people coming right out of grad school to work at APT, I think that they think the concept of working on proposals is a real bear. But I think that it doesn't have to be from kind of a technical expert standpoint, because we do have this opportunity to specialize and divide and conquer. And for me, it makes work on proposals, though it's intense for sure, it's enjoyable because it means that I get to think about new problems and solutions to them in the context of proposing what we might do for a new piece of work. What else? And I also mentioned the whole concept of competition versus partnership in that kind of social network picture. But I think that the competition versus partnership thing, there definitely are situations where APT will partner with another large firm in part to make our bid most competitive. But sometimes it's also because of capacity. Even though we are large, we still, in my area of the company, we have 200 and some people. And for the quantity of work that we're doing, sometimes that's not enough, or the people that we would like to bid on a particular project are overbooked, or our client would know that they don't have enough time to contribute to yet another project for that same client. And so we do partner with other large firms to expand our capacity, but then also with small firms in cases, one for capacity, but then also for a particular niche area of expertise, or in terms of responding to requirements that we have small business partners. So it's a situation where I don't really feel like we are competitors. The people that I know in Mathematica, MDRC, Urban Institute, AIR, and the like, I feel like we work in different companies, and of course, when we're going alone, we want to win the project and we don't want them to win. But I do feel like it's kind of, to a certain extent, a friendly industry in that regard. And I can give you one totally unrelated example. Our companies are part of a DEI collaborative that our CEO set up, where we are working to advance and transform our industry with regard to both internal DEI practices, but then also the part that I'm involved in is integrating equity within our research practice. And so we have a 9-company training series where we're engaging together to figure out how to improve the nature and quality of our research in this regard, because this is a situation where we want to transform society, and it's better to be in coordination and collaboration with one another than in competition when something like social justice is on the line. So, thought there. Okay, so I guess that's it. That was the arc of what I wanted to talk about, and happy to. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see everyone's faces. And would love to hear your thoughts on this or other particular questions, either about my somewhat unusual career arc, or about my reflections on how the big enterprises get and carry out their work. And if you do want to ask a question, it seems to me you could put it in the chat that I may or may not be able to see, but you also could just unmute yourself as well.
Well, Laura, okay, I'll start us off. How would you characterize the quality of these, big time evaluations that are being done? I mean, it may be state of the art on paper, but are they really are they really as informative as they could be, or is it a lot of sort of meat and potatoes and not much spice, you know? If I may
Well,
draw
I
that
can't talk
analogy.
to, yeah, I mean, I can't talk to all of the evaluations that APT is in the midst of right now, or even ones outside of our company. But I can say that the projects that I work on, we try to strike the right balance of like the combination of cutting edge and quality, right? There are some things that are just tried and true, and we want to build on those, but there are also opportunities to innovate. Sometimes that puts you on a slippery slope. I know you and I have talked about that methodologically, going back, I don't know, maybe a dozen AEA years ago.
I think so.
But I think that, I mean, the reason that government keeps funding the work that we do is that they are pleased with the results. I think that is an indicator of it being high quality. And some of the work that that I have done, you know, I'll give you an example. The Health Profession Opportunity Grant Program evaluation is one where the program itself was initially funded in 2010. The evaluation kicked off in 2012. It was to be an $8 million evaluation, which is huge, right? But in the course of the first couple of years of implementing the evaluation, the funding agency decided to increase that budget by $4 million, a 50% increase for that evaluation alone. And now with offshoots and the second round of HPOG grants, I think that APT is up to almost $100 million of HPOG specific research funding as a portfolio, right? So I don't think that they would continue to fund that line of work to such a huge magnitude if they weren't finding value in it. And we certainly do try to ensure that the methods that we use are top-notch and rigorous, that we are thinking about creative and innovative ways to deploy those methods. We've been working really hard at ensuring that the products from this research are accessible and policy relevant. And so, for example, I think that I feel like I have tended in my life, because my father has a Ph.D. in English and he forced me to be a good writer. I think that I have generally been a good writer thanks to my dad, but not necessarily thanks to grad school. Sorry, NYU, but I didn't really learn how to write until I was having to write for government clients. And I think that we have really pushed the envelope in recent years with making, you know, big old clunky government reports accessible and policy relevant, focused on practitioners, people who are on the ground carrying out the work that we're evaluating. And so if you are interested, I can share a couple of examples of kind of recent transformative written work that we've done. But concretely, I can tell you that the 3-year report for the HPOG evaluation, the main report was like 70 pages and there was a 100-page appendix. And the 6-year report is 12 pages.
Mm.
How in the world? I mean, it takes longer to write less and still get the same message across, but it's one of the things that I feel like we've been putting a lot of emphasis on, is ensuring that we as evaluators have the skills and capability to translate and be concise in our writing. Okay, there's some questions there. I can try to read, or someone can translate them for me.
Thanks.
Okay, so so Lori Wingate is asking a question about how we hire people. Do we look at people with skills that cut across the competency domains, or do we hire people kind of with deep skills? So it's interesting. This answer to this would probably be a little bit different from a small firm perspective, where they need MVPs, right? The all-purpose players. We need both people who are cross-cutting, but then we need people who are deep. And so I think that when we hire people who are new PhDs and we talk about what it's like to work at a place like APT, we tend to make a distinction between kind of like you having your own research agenda that you drive, as opposed to contributing to a kind of broad government funded research agenda. So if you're that person who is really interested in kind of the developmental response for second graders to kind of tutoring and mentoring interventions, you know, if we don't have a second grade tutoring evaluation going on at APT, and that's your thing, then you may be dissatisfied working at a place like APT, right? Because if you are the one who wants to have complete control over your research agenda, that's not going to happen. But what I can say is that if you're interested in policy analysis and program evaluation generally, education generally, or social policy generally, the kind of work that we get is really interesting and important. It's the kind of work that government wants answers to questions about. And so if you can bring your technical skills and apply them flexibly to a wide variety of research areas, it's really fun. And since I'm sort of content agnostic, it is a really fun place for me to be, because it's given me an opportunity to be the methodological lead with a substantive lead where I get to continually learn about new substantive areas. Lori, does that kind of partly answer your question? Any follow-up that you want me to do on that?
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I was also thinking, I had in mind thinking about like like communication skills and project management skills and knowledge of theory. I think I tend to gravitate toward those methodological skills, but how important is it that they also, you know, maybe have conflict resolution, or, you know, just so thinking across those domains that are pretty broad, and it can be overwhelming when you look at those for people coming into the field. Like, I have to know how to do all of that. Like, it's a lot.
Right. Well, I think that I would boil it down to your technical chops. You need that in whatever area that is for you. If you're qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, whatever your technical box is, you need that. But then I do think that the next two top priority skills are writing and teamwork. Because as I said, we don't do anything independently, it's all collaboratively. And I think that the other thing that is infusing through everything that we're doing right now is knowledge of equitable principles and practices, not only for the way that we work in partnership, but also in the substance of carrying out the research, right? So the people who have experience with participatory research practices, bringing those into what has otherwise been a sort of outside-in evaluation space is kind of the way that we are evolving, and we're trying to evolve to bring those kinds of perspectives together so that we can remain some, you know, if there is such a thing as an unbiased outside evaluator, but with greater engagement with the communities that our evaluations are aiming to serve, right? So it's not like us versus you, but together, let's bring our voices together so that we can reflect your voice in the work, and you can understand the way in which we're doing research and evolve both of those to the benefit of both the process and the outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next question that I see in the chat, which is, what are the trends that I see in government and contracts and grants for evaluation over the next 5 to 10 years? I think that that's probably a question that's better posed to some of my other colleagues. One of the things I mentioned in the paper I didn't really talk much about today is that when it comes, we have these things that we call like account leads or portfolio leads. They're the people who really have their pulse on that, where the direction that federal funding is going. And they're the ones who decide, yes, we're going to pursue this particular proposal or not. And then I'm the one who kind of partners with them to help execute on the technical side. But I do have to say, in the months after Trump took office, there were our project officers in the agencies had a bunch of money that they needed to spend before the end of the fiscal year, the federal fiscal year. And so at the outset of that, we actually increased our funding because there was the opportunity to do so. And so we got a lot of, oh, here's the extra $100,000. Let's figure out how to up our response rate or add these dozen questions to the survey. And so I think that there are ebbs and flows with regard to the kind of political environment, but and definitely evidence had been poo-pooed, but I think you all know that evidence has made a comeback. And you know, and so my hope is that there will be structures that are embedded in the agencies that will ensure that regardless of the political winds, there will be, you know, chief evaluation officers, data officers in place to ensure that those mechanisms can remain or at least be somewhat protected despite the political ebbs and flows. So there's this other question here. How does APT handle issues of quality assurance and evaluation? Any built-in processes that might be seen as meta-evaluative? So each project has a quality reviewer and sometimes two. If there's one person who can do the trick, then we'll do that. But sometimes you need sort of maybe a qualitative and a quantitative person or a substantive and methodological expert to kind of review all of the research protocols kind of procedurally, but then also the documents that we have as outputs. The meta-evaluative work that we do, I think kind of falls under my role as global lead for our capability center. It's kind of an internal function. I mean, outside of that, I don't know that people would think of us as having a capability center, but I get the opportunity to look across our really diverse portfolios. I'm in, you know, the social and economic policy division where I focus on housing, job training, education, those kinds of things. But then because of my cross-cutting role, I also get to dip into the work that we're doing for the CDC and HRSA on health, for the EPA on the environment, and internationally on all sorts of varied, really interesting international development and governance kinds of projects around the world. And so we hope that in each of those substantive areas, the people who are tapped as the quality reviewers are ones that are the right quality assurance people for that project. But then if they feel like they need some kind of cross-cutting person, it's either me or people who I will deploy into that cross-cutting space. So I'm not sure if that's entirely what you meant as meta-evaluative, but we do try to have a cross-cutting perspective where feasible. And we do have an IRB. APT has an IRB, and we definitely process everything that we need through that IRB. I have experienced them to be more timely in their responsiveness than my old university IRB, so that's a perk. Well, Michael, I saw you take yourself off mute. Did you want to follow up on any other quality assurance topics?
No, not really. I mean, it's my research area, so I'm kind of curious about that, as to see what kind of a private organization does. You know, there's a number of them out there that have, you know, where they take reports and from their grantees and send them through a review process to kind of rate them and see what they're doing with them. And I wondered if there was anything internally that kind of, you know, even just looks at whether the reporting is as thorough as it needs to be. Kind of back to what Steve's question was somewhat, is like, you know, is the spice in there? Is the meat and potatoes all in there? You know, is it as useful as it could be, or, you know, potentially be? I wonder whether, you know, how that, if there's some sort of a system in place to ensure your quality, your work stays as strong, as high quality as possible.
Well, beyond our own internal quality review procedures, projects very often, I wouldn't say 100% of them, I'm going to put it at maybe 2/3 of projects will have a technical review panel that the government kind of just funded to be part of it, right? So once we have our design report, we go to the technical review panel and have them review it. Those tend to be outsiders, very often university people. I'm sure some of you have served on a technical working group for some apps project in the past, or might be willing to in the future, where, you know, they read the, sometimes in the olden days, the pre-COVID days, we would bring the technical review panel to the DOL offices in DC, and we'd sit there and we'd hash out our design plans and be sure that they're kind of meeting the expectations that for excellence that we have. But and frankly, at a place like APT, we have nothing if we don't have our reputation for excellence and quality, right? So it's super important that's how we continue to get our work more than anything else, is that we just do great work and hope that it means that we are competitive for the next round of it. I know. So, hi, Jessica. You were the first face that I saw who shared your video, and thank you for that. I appreciate being able to see your smiling face. And so Jessica's question is, having been a faculty member and a researcher, what are the pros and cons of the different roles? And I know that we have talked about that in the past. There are trade-offs. One of the things that I found completely bizarre when I moved from being at ASU to working at APT was that I had to submit a timesheet, right? Like one of those lawyer jobs. And so I found it super annoying. I had to count for all of my time. And at the end of the week, I have to have 40 hours on my timesheet. But the reason that we have to do that, this is for ethical reasons and compliance reasons. I need to be sure that that when I'm working on my project for HHS, that my time is allocated to that project and not to my project for SSA, right? And this time is not billable to a project at all, and that's a different way that I account for it on my timesheet. And in some cases, you know, work like this is not on a timesheet, but instead voluntary. So the beyond, I mean, that's kind of a small thing. One of the things though that I realized was at some point that I actually have come to find the timesheet as being somewhat liberating, because at the university, I felt like I was always on. There was always more to read, write, do, think. When I was associate dean, I had to be on all the time, right? Because, you know, there was one point where a student of ours went missing and was unaccounted for. And I was on the hook for figuring that out. And it didn't matter that that afternoon I was at the park with my 4-year-old, right? I needed to be at work to take care of that. And now I don't really have any of those kind of life or death pressing safety circumstances. So when I get to my 40 hours on the week, I find the timesheet sort of liberating for me to check out. It gives me permission to check out. And so from that perspective, I do feel like I have a much clearer line between work and life. And I can walk away at the end of the day and check out pretty well. There are times where that's not the case, like when there is a proposal due and we need all hands on deck for however many hours it takes to meet the deadline. But most of the time, I feel like I have a pretty good, I'm able to maintain a relatively sane balance. A trade-off there, though, is that in a university setting, there is a kind of built-in period for respite after moments of intense work. So at the end of a semester, you actually can check out. I mean, doesn't mean that you don't have to, you know, there might be things that you want to do, but nobody is going to be checking on you whether you're in the office in the semester break. You just have to do what you need to do on whatever timeline and days and, you know, settings that make the most sense for you to sanely do that, so that when January 20th comes back around, you're there with your syllabus in hand, ready to go for the next semester. I don't have that built-in period of respite, so I need to make it. Probably the most important trade-off that I've seen that is why I am still at Apt and not back at a university has to do with the impact of my work. Like I said, when I was at ASU, I kind of was that one person doing evaluation work in my little space and doing it with my students and with local agencies. While that certainly had value, I feel like the connection that I've had to the staff in the federal agencies has allowed me to create what I think are some pretty great relationships that mean that now I have the ear of either policymakers or people who have the policymakers' ear. So I'm much closer to that. And the work that I'm doing, instead of publishing it in a scholarly journal and hoping that somebody might read it and it might matter, I actually know that it matters because the project officers are taking it to their grantees and like translating the lessons directly. They're taking it and they're going and providing testimony to Congress on reauthorization of the programs that we're evaluating. And so I do feel like that's probably one of the biggest selling points in terms of trade-offs, is it just feels like it's bigger and bigger impact. So. And there's, at some point, I don't want to spend more time talking about that, but there's other like little nitty grittier things that, you know, I don't have to sit on the bylaws committee or review tenure and promotion cases, which is, you know, some important duty like work that one does at a university. I have my own little version of that. And I do still feel like I get opportunities to teach in the context of project execution or proposal work, but then there's no like grading or grade negotiation or things on that side. Really, it's just a matter of teaching and mentoring in order to do the best work that we can do. And I kind of, people come to me already relatively well-trained and ready to kind of learn and practice.
Thanks, Laura.
So, yeah, sure. So the other question I see here is, yeah.
I want to do an interaction. My name is Rukaya. Hi, Laura.
Yeah.
I am an
Hello.
IDPE student and working on my dissertation. My dissertation is all about the marketplace and the demand for evaluation. And that led me to my question. I'm just gonna pick a little bit on your paper and the NDE and how you talked about the big 8 as large-scale evaluation agencies that are dominating the market, because one of the things that were talked about in this issue was how much the market is of an oligopoly market, which is it's dominated by big organizations, and those people are, or those organizations are dictating to some extent, let me put it this way, the evaluation directions. But is that true? Is it a domination? How much is it of, do they do the design? My experience with one of the agencies was that this evaluation is designed by the agency, and the implementing partners or the implementing agencies are just following the prints that the agency put forward for them. That's one of the agencies. Right.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that ultimately in the space that I'm in, this is mostly federal contract space, right? So
Yes.
there are Apt does not do evaluations with kind of your local United Way nonprofit consortium. Those evaluation efforts do tend to be with like the designated staff inside that agency, the one person who, you know, 20% of her job is to be the internal evaluator, or they are partnering with a local small firm of one person or a handful of people who are what I think of as sort of, and I don't mean this in a diminutive way, but like a mom and pop shop, right? Like just a smaller local, can be responsive to particular needs there. But when it comes to talking about the federal government, which is really who we respond to, on the one hand, the federal government does, to a certain extent, dictate what they think the design of an evaluation should be. And sometimes they leave it open, right? When they do dictate what they think the design should be, we as entities that respond to that, we can agree with that and just propose to do that, or we can discuss a myriad of options. And I think that the HPOG example is one where it's really interesting because the OPRE, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within ACF and HHS, they had originally expected and put the request for proposals out there that it would be an evaluation of 3 to 6 large grantees, large because they needed sufficient sample size to detect effects of the magnitude that they would be expecting, and that we would go through a process of selecting which of those 3 to 6 large programs from among the 32 grantees would be part of the impact evaluation. So we proposed that we would do that. And when we got the funding, we said, we don't think this is the best way to do this. We actually think what you should do is include all grantees, hence the expansion of the budget from 8 to 12 million. Because this is a national funding stream, and if you capture the impacts of 3 to 6 large sites, you're capturing impacts of those idiosyncratic places that happen to be large. You're not going to say anything about small programs. You're not going to learn anything about the major diversity of implementation that exists in the field. And so we convinced them on what we refer to as our all-in strategy after we got the contract awarded to us. And we completely transformed the evaluation from being, 3 to 6 standalone evaluations of large programs to a single evaluation of 42 programs across 23 grantees in 19 states nationwide. So it was a really different design. It required our client, people in the agency, to be willing to make that evolution. But I think that, they want to do the right and best research. And if we have better ideas and we can convince them about that, either in the proposal or after contract award, I think that's what we do if we think that there is a better technical approach. But you're absolutely right that sometimes there are situations where the request for proposal says you do this, and then the proposal says we will do this, and then they carry on in that direction.
Do you consider most
but I
of
think
the...
I don't know. I have more. I think I have more intellectual respect for the people in the agencies. They're really smart, and I think they don't want to just do. At least the agencies that I work most closely with. So I could even talk about like HUD, Education, HHS. There are a bunch of really great guys there that want to do the right and best research for a given research question, and they will listen to evaluation experts about what does it mean to do the right best research for these questions, right? Matching design with question and that kind of thing. They're not very cookie cutter.
Thank you
very much, Dr. Peck, and thank you all for your attendance. I'll be sure to register for the next Eval Cafe. We'll be joined by Kerry Smith. She's the president and founder of Evaluation into Action. We'll be having a discussion on fostering evaluation organizational culture. So stay tuned for the follow-up email and the recording of this discussion. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Take care, everyone. Be well.